The Holy Gospel according to Mark, the first chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
As soon as Jesus and the disciples left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sunset, they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons, and the whole city was gathered around their door. And Jesus cured many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons, and he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. In the morning, while it was still very dark, Jesus got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. When they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is searching for you." He answered, "Let us go on to the neighboring towns, so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came out to do." And he went throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Every now and then I find a documentary-style show on TV that really catches my attention. And these past few nights this week, I've been pulling up a series that I recorded from the past few weeks from the National Geographic channel called Chain of Command. I don't know if anyone's seen that one. It's basically a documentary that follows along with the United States military as they continue the fight against terrorism and the fight against ISIS, mostly alongside the Iraqi military, but also in their work all around the world. It's an inside look, as the name describes, at the chain of command, all the way from the White House and the Pentagon, all the way across the world to the battle lines in Iraq. There's a lot in this show that I would love to talk about because there's a lot of it that has struck a chord with me. But there's one piece in particular that really caught my attention and really spoke to what I think we've been hearing here recently. And that was the second episode of this series, and they titled it Perception and Reality. And the very last line that the narrator spoke during the introduction to this episode was how that in fighting terrorism, the goal is to stop a false perception from becoming a dangerous reality. Again, the goal is to stop a false perception from becoming a dangerous reality. What I took that to mean from the show is that there's a large number of people going off to join terrorist groups because we believe they're drawn by these false perceptions. They're lured into participating by the promise of this homogeneous utopia that could exist if enough people start fighting for it. They're lured into participating with the assurance that they are right and everyone else is wrong, and we must overcome that wrong ideal by any means necessary. They're lured by any number of promises that are just truly and deeply false. And because they follow through with these false perceptions of what things can be or what they believe they should be, they create this reality for them and for the rest of the world that becomes incredibly dangerous. I feel like that was the point of this episode that I watched, to show that this part of fighting terrorism is an attempt to stop this false perception from becoming a dangerous reality, and how complicated that can be. And as soon as the narrator said that, or the announcer said that, I had to pause the show. I had to rewind it, and I listened to it again. I started writing that down and writing down notes about it. This is why you don't want to watch TV with me. Because it made me wonder if we are guilty of doing just that. Not in the name of terrorism, I'm not saying that, but are we guilty in creating a dangerous reality around us because of false perceptions that we have convinced ourselves to believe. It's often something we do unintentionally, really. So I think there are a few ways to think about this. And one came up a couple weeks ago in our confirmation class. In confirmation, we've been discussing the 10 commandments for many weeks. And of course, one of the 10 is the 8th commandment, which is, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. And the question, what does this mean? Well, I know you haven't memorized, but Luther says, we are to fear and love God so that we do not tell lies about our neighbor, betray or slander them, or destroy their reputations. Instead, we are to come to their defense, speak well of them, and interpret everything they do in the best possible light. And I take Luther's question again, what does that mean? Okay, it's not about stealing or coveting our neighbor's stuff. No, that's the other commandments. This commandment is about protecting your neighbor through the words that you use, or the perceptions that you have of them, or sometimes the perceptions that you create of them. This commandment is about protecting your neighbor's reality. Of course, we had to break that down a little bit more because that didn't really make sense to us. So we started thinking about perception and reality when it comes to, actors and actresses that we see on TV or in movies. Think about it. If someone is cast in the same role all the time, or the same kind of role all the time, what do you think when you see them in a completely different role? Or when you see them out in real life, outside of that acting role? I mean, what do you think about when you think of John Wayne? What do you think about when you hear that character, Phoebe Buffay, from that TV show Friends? What do you think about when you hear comedian Will Ferrell? I mean, what happens when those people you see play characters who are totally different from what we're used to? I mean, it feels like it's incorrect, right? That person's not a villain. He's always the hero. Or, how is this person intelligent? They're always so dumb. Or could we ever take a comedic actor seriously? You see how perceptions easily become our reality? Our confirmation class was quick to point out that that's often what happens in bullying, too. We would take a false perception about a person and push it on that person over and over and over again until it starts to feel like the reality for that person being bullied. Even if we know that something is false, if we say it over and over again, we begin to believe it. And I think we've all seen the harm that can do. If we can agree that that's one definition of how bullying works, I think it's a safe bet to say that every single one of us here has bullied ourselves. Unfortunately, I'm sure there's many of us here who have bullied other people at some point in our life, which, of course, shame on us, and we need to do better. But I think we often don't talk about bullying ourselves. How many of us have told ourselves that we're what? Too ugly, too fat, not good enough, not hardworking enough, not lovable, not forgivable, not joyful, not someone who God would be proud of? How many times have we told ourselves that, or something like that, so many times that we start to believe it? But then we hear God again. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. And I would bet that God would include that to mean, you shall not bear false witness against yourself. Because as we've seen, it's so easy for that false perception to become a dangerous reality. So what does it take then to counter this dangerous reality? Well, as this show reminded me, and as we've seen with terrorism and the fight against it, we've had nearly 17 years of direct military involvement with no end in sight. With bullying, we know that bullying is extremely difficult and almost if not entirely impossible to undo. So I think we can agree that when something becomes a reality, it's not very easy to undo or reverse. So I began to wonder about God's kingdom in that sense. Have we created dangerous realities of God's kingdom that are impossible to reverse? Have we perverted God's love to only be for some and not for others? Have we limited the expansiveness of who God is in this world? Have we tried to explain away the mystery of how God works in our lives? Is there a different reality out there that we as followers of Jesus need to profess to the world or confess for ourselves? And what is this reality? I think we catch a glimpse of this reality in Jesus' ministry, which we hear in Mark's gospel today. We know that Jesus at this point has gathered some disciples to follow him. He's been preaching and teaching in the synagogues with authority. He's cast out those unclean spirits. And now we hear, as he tries to find rest for the night, he finds this woman sick in bed. And he restores her to health and wholeness. And we hear in response to that, she begins to serve him. In that short scene in this gospel story, just 2 sentences, we have a deep reflection on who Jesus is and the reality of this kingdom he's bringing. This woman is lifted up from her bed and she serves. I believe it's reflective of Jesus because Mark uses the same word for being lifted up here with this woman as he will later in the gospel as he talks about Jesus being raised to new life. The gospel writer of Mark also uses the same word for service, the way this woman serves Jesus, that he will later in the gospel when it says Jesus came to serve and not be served. Is that the reality of this world and God's kingdom that we believe to be true? Is that the perception of who God is that we can believe into making that reality come alive in us? I've always hear us say that making changes in this world is impossible, and it's so difficult. But I've seen that time and time again that when we believe in false perceptions or negative attitudes, that those perceptions and attitudes become our reality very easily. But why can't we do that with this good news? With the good news that Jesus came to serve us, that Jesus came to die for us and to rise for us and to lift each and every one of us up to new life and to whole life. What would happen if we changed our perception of this world from one of self-centeredness and selfishness to one of humbleness and service? When we live into this good news over and over and over again, and when we believe this good news for us over and over again, just imagine the new reality of this world that we can create. A reality that is God's kingdom. Amen.